You are a professor at Regent University. You run the Israel Institute for Regent University, and you're actually in Jerusalem right now amid the conflict going on between Israel and Iran. So before we dive into really any details, just tell us a little bit about what it's been like there in Jerusalem.
Yeah, so thanks for that intro. So my wife and I are staying in the Old City at a place called Christ Church, right inside the Jaffa Gate. It's a wonderful Anglican community there. About 3 o'clock in the morning, we heard alerts on our phone on Friday, and went down to the shelter, and eventually found out that this was because Israel was attacking Iran, and they were expecting a response. And so that was our experience of the start of this. I would say since then, it's been sort of a surreal divide in Jerusalem between the day and the night. Daytime Jerusalem is still functioning, not as hustle bustle as normal. The Old City really is kind of a ghost town. We were there last Saturday with a tour that we were with, and it was very bustling. You had people in the markets, you had vendors trying to sell all sorts of things. Obviously hurting for the tourist trade, really wanting the tourist trade to come back, but still there were people out. If you walk around the Old City now, it's very quiet, almost eerily quiet. But outside, there's still stuff going on. We've been to Machane Yehuda, which is the big food market here in Jerusalem, just getting a feel for that. And their shops are open. There's people buying, getting food, getting things like that. You can get cabs, you can move about. So during the daytime, unless you are very familiar with Jerusalem, you probably wouldn't necessarily know there's a war on. If you were, you would know that something's going on, because it takes much less time, I'm told, to get from place to place in Jerusalem than it normally does. But then at night, usually between 8 and 10, and then again kind of between 1:30 and 4, you'll hear alerts, and then you'll hear the sirens, and you can hear the sounds of the interceptors being fired. You can hear the sound sometimes of missile impacts. Jerusalem, not as many rockets targeted at us as other places in Israel. So if you kind of drew a map, there's a circle around Jerusalem that hasn't seen as much. But you can hear it, you can see it. It's disruptive at night. I kind of have joked with a couple of Israelis. I haven't had this much sleep disruption since my kids were little. My kids were babies and were waking up all the time. But I'd much rather wake up to a baby's cry than to, the Iranians sending some things our way. So it's two different worlds, the day and the night.
So what has been your sense generally from conversations you've had with Israelis, from people there in Jerusalem? What are they feeling as this is ongoing?
I've talked with people that are pro-Netanyahu, people that are anti. I've talked with Jewish Israelis. You hear a little bit from some of the Arab voices as well. And almost unanimously, they're saying, this had to be done. This is important. Iran is an existential threat. And they're very supportive of what their country is doing, even as they are going through what they're going through. Because when Israelis fight over politics, which they do a lot, it's because they really believe in their country. And I think there's an understanding this is an existential threat. And as the Israelis are going into shelters because of ballistic missiles, it's not hard to think and imagine what those missiles would do if they were tipped with nuclear-tipped warheads. There was one missile that did all the damage in Bat Yam, of the ones they've shot at us. And so it's indescribable to imagine Iran having nuclear weapons and sending these missiles at Israel. And so the population, I think, is trying to, as much as possible, carry on with normal life and accepting that this is a necessary part of the war. And they will have those political fights, but they will have them when the war is done.
So for even people who are, as you mentioned, there are some that you've heard from who are maybe not even that supportive of Netanyahu, but they're supportive of this action. What do they feel right now? Because they're kind of in a weird place, right? They don't really like Netanyahu, but they do support this action that their military is taking.
Well, this used to be something that we did as Americans, right? Partisanship stops at the water's edge. I'm sure there's a lot of people that really didn't like FDR in the run-up to World War II. But when the war starts, you support your country, even if you don't necessarily like the person who's running it. And the Israelis still have that. Another example of that, again, even people that aren't supportive of the government, that are very critical, that are even have some criticisms of what policies have been done in Gaza, they don't support the protesters in America because they say they just don't understand. They don't understand how hard we try not to kill civilians. They don't understand the country. They don't understand what they're talking about. And so there's two conversations. One is the internal, about, they'll be very critical, but then externally, they'll say, you need to understand our perspective. And there is such a thing, an Israeli perspective on some of these issues. And Iran is one, where there's a real sense that these are people that want to wipe Israel off the map. They don't care about, the minutiae of judicial reform or, the balance between bringing the hostages home and wiping out Hamas, and how we balance those imperatives, which are the debates the Israelis are having. The Israelis can distinguish between a political battle and an existential threat. And that is something as Americans, I think sometimes, especially in times of crisis, that we can use to relearn that from them.
So when you put on your hat of geopolitical expertise and you're kind of looking at the situation in the Middle East in particular, how do you see this conflict between Israel and Iran maybe reshaping some relationships in the Arab world?
I would go further than that. I would say this is a region-defining moment. We are witnessing a pivot in the history of the Middle East that began on October 7th, and this is the end of that beginning. And the reason for that is on October 7th, a perception was created that Israel was vulnerable. And now a perception is being created that Israel is strong. And there's a misunderstanding that people often have from a Western perspective, where in the West, we sometimes tend to praise vulnerability, and we're a little bit more cautious about countries that show strength, and we tend to like the underdog. That's not how Arab Middle Eastern perspectives are. They want to back the strong horse. And so this is, whatever governments are saying publicly, this is really, I think, going to open things up for Israel, because now Israel is seen as strong, and Iran, which was seen as this colossus that was bestriding the region that everyone was afraid of, now they don't look so strong. And so that is a huge shift in the region. I think it's hard to say yet what the fallout of that is going to be. A lot will depend. I'll know more in 2 weeks than I know right now. I may know more in 48 hours. But you can feel the ground shifting. And if Israel is able to really win a decisive victory here, that could reshape the Middle East in ways that would be beneficial for Israel. It would be beneficial for us as well, because it will allow America to maybe organize its priorities in a way that it wants to, that are less dictated by events in the region. And so, this is a big moment. This is history, I think, is being made. The question is, how far are they going to be able to go? How far are they going to be allowed to go? And how much of a pivot and how much of a change do we see from this moment?
I want to go back, AJ, actually, to something we were talking about earlier, which is just that with those things in mind, the general tenor of the mood there in Israel. I think for us in the West, for us in the United States, it's a little bit difficult for us to grapple with what is it like to be in a country that is constantly either being attacked or now is on the offensive and defending themselves from a potential, or preemptively defending themselves from a potential attack. What is a life like there? Do Israelis feel safe amid all of this going on and the geopolitical things at play?
I think it's not a feeling of safety necessarily. It's more a sense that there are certain things that you have to do. Life goes on, and you have to adjust to the reality that you're in. And Israelis have a phrase in Hebrew, gam vagam, this and that. And it's the idea of like the mix of the sorrow and the joy, the mix of laughter, even amidst tears. And you can really feel that with the war. And that Israeli attitude of, recognizing and staying calm and so on is infectious. And, I've watched, even as Americans in the midst of this, or like myself, like my wife, are being infected by that Israeli sensibility in a positive way, because it keeps you from freaking out.
Well, before we let you go, AJ, I want to ask you too about really the larger biblical and prophetic potentially significance to all of this. As a Christian, Talk about some of that. How should we be kind of contextualizing this conflict between Israel and Iran?
As I've been touring, I was on tour before this, and so as I've been touring the land, just walking through the land of the Bible, feeling the different climates, stepping in the places where Jesus stepped, where prophets and patriarchs and priests stepped, you get a sense of the sacred importance of this place. In the old city of Jerusalem, it's particularly intense. And so I have been meditating on the idea of the peace of Jerusalem. And the way that I've been praying through it is that the peace of Jerusalem would be found here, that it would begin with protection. The word shalom means the destruction of the order that causes chaos. And Iran has sought to establish, and its proxies have sought to establish, an order that causes chaos. I walk through Kibbutz Be'eri and I see the rubble, and you hear about the rubble in Gaza. And that chaos is the order that Iran and its proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, want to create. And so to bring shalom, Israel has taken it upon itself to destroy that order, which is a service to them and to Western civilization and to the Judeo-Christian values and biblical values that we share. And so my prayer is that the peace of Jerusalem, that shalom of Jerusalem, will spread from here all the way out to the east, and that even to the freedom of the Iranian people who are suffering, even to the freedom of the people in Gaza who are suffering under Hamas, that the peace of Jerusalem would come and the region would be reshaped, and that we would see God's redemptive work in history made manifest through this process.
You know, you mentioned the peace of Jerusalem, and it made me think of a speech Netanyahu gave not long after all of this began, which was him reaching out directly to the Iranian people, saying, we feel a camaraderie with you. We want to see you liberated, to see freedom, to see peace reign in Iran, as well as in Israel. So talk about that may be strange, at least in the Western mind, that strange camaraderie between the Israeli people and the Iranian people.
Well, from a biblical perspective, I would point people back to the book of Ezra, which begins with a proclamation from Cyrus, the king of Persia, inviting the people of Israel, saying that God has declared that a house should be built for him in Jerusalem. He is the God of who lives in Jerusalem, and may he be with his people, and may they go back in safety to rebuild. And so the last time there was an exile and the Jewish people returned, it was the hands of a Persian king. So this is something that we see even to the Bible. And of course, before 1979, there's very warm personal relationships between many Iranians, many people in the Persian world, and many Israelis. And so I think the Israelis are praying for that, and we can pray for that, not simply because of history, but also because of biblical history. And there's something deep within that society, I think, that longs and has a yearning for freedom and for religious freedom, and for freedom of conscience that is being oppressed. And, you know, we look in the book of Esther and Haman, who uses his position as essentially the vizier, the ruler of the Persian Empire, to try to wipe out the Jews. But then the Persian people, you know, the Persian king says, no, we're not going to do this. And so that's sort of this tension point, right? We're almost like at an Esther moment. And I think that also freed Persia at the time from the rule of wicked counselors. And so we can hope and pray for that as well, that right now the Persian people are under the rule of wicked counselors. They're under the rule of kind of that spirit of Haman. But we can pray for freedom, and we can pray for that they would be liberated, and that a new Cyrus would come in to bring peace between Persia and the Jewish people, and even between Christians in the West as well.
Absolutely. Well, amen to all of that. Dr. A.J. Nolte, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Glad to do it.